The other thing that I would urge all our health departments around the state is to continue on the hiring of the new tracers. I know that you have people who are already employed who are doing this, but we're going to continue to see spikes in different places, and it's important to be ready to tackle that. But again, we're there as a backup. We're there to give you help. This is the way, the testing, the tracing, this is the way we can be on the offense in regard to the coronavirus. Very, very, very important that we do this as we move forward. I would like to thank Attorney General Dave Yost for being with us today. Dave, thank you very, very much for being here. And I will speak first, and then the Attorney General will speak, and then we'll go to questions from the news media. The death of Mr. Floyd and the subsequent protests, demonstrations, and the violence have appeared really to lay bare some of our deep divisions in this country. Over the last several weeks, I've heard from many people with different views. It strikes me, though, that many of these views are really not that far apart, and they're not mutually inconsistent. One can certainly believe that protests are appropriate and, in fact, needed, but also believe that violence is wrong and that violence is counterproductive. One can believe that the protests are good, but also that protesters should practice social distancing and wear masks to protect themselves and others, and many did. Some, unfortunately, did not. One can believe that most police men and women are dedicated public servants who risk their lives every single day to protect us. And also believe that there are some officers that should not be police officers. With the divisions that we have seen, we continue to see, it is important that we take every opportunity to pull together, because what unites us is so much stronger than what divides us. All of us, no matter the color of our skin or the way we worship, are so much more alike than we are different. The citizens rallying across this state, all but a fraction, are good people who want change, good people who don't want violence. They want to be heard. They want to be treated equally. They want to feel safe in society. They want everyone to be treated equally. Our law enforcement officers, all but a fraction, are good people who risk their lives for us each and every day. During the demonstrations in Ohio, we saw occasions where police officers, deputies marched beside demonstrators and joined in prayer circles. We've seen when demonstrators took a knee in protest in Columbus, we saw some law enforcement officers kneel as well. And there are other examples. The truth is that for the last few years, many law enforcement agencies across the state have worked hard to improve their community police relations and to enhance public trust. Many agencies have done a great job, and we must and we should acknowledge that. We must also, though, acknowledge that there are some officers in Ohio who just are not cut out to be in law enforcement. And they have no place being in a position of trust. We must do more to make sure that officers who lack that professionalism and who show racial bias, who are biased, are not wearing a badge in the state of Ohio. Last week I told you about our initial plans for meaningful police reform in Ohio, including the development of a new standard throughout the state for law enforcement's response to mass protests. We're working to get uniformity and get a best practice in place. We also talked about enhanced efforts to ensure more law enforcement agencies meet Ohio's standards for that use of force. Last week, I also announced the creation of a new Office of Law Enforcement Recruitment to help improve the representation of minorities and women in law enforcement agencies. This new office will develop and share best practices on the hiring of candidates who are best suited for this great career. It will assist agencies looking to hire more minorities and to hire more women. I'm pleased to announce this afternoon that Dr. Patrick Oliver, who currently serves as the Director of the Criminal Justice Program at Cedarville University, has agreed to serve as the lead consultant to this office. Dr. Oliver served for 27 years in law enforcement, including 11 years as a trooper with the Ohio State Highway Patrol. And he has served as the police chief in Fairborn, Grandview Heights, Cleveland, and as the ranger chief of the Cleveland Metropolitan Parks. We're very grateful to work with Dr. Oliver. I've worked with him in the past, and he will be a great addition. The steps announced last week are steps that I could take immediately as your governor. But many of the other things that need to be done take legislative action, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We've been talking with many members of the legislature, talked with Representative Phil Plummer, Representative Cindy Abrams, about the bill that they unveiled last week on law enforcement reform. And I look forward to working with them and all members of the General Assembly. This morning I spoke again with members of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus. I listened to their concerns. I told them some of the things that I would be outlining to you today. And let me just say, in regard to them and to other members of the General Assembly and to anyone who is watching out there today, this is a process. This is not just go do something and then move on. This is a process, and we must all commit to staying with that process for many, many months and many, many years ahead. Many of the things that I will outline today have been part of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus's agenda for some period of time. The ultimate goal that I believe we all should share is to improve law enforcement accountability, training, and transparency. Accountability, training, transparency, and in that way, we can build public trust in law enforcement. Let me start with the first item. Today I'm asking the members of the General Assembly to require that before a person can begin training to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio, they must first pass a psychological test showing that they are fit to be an officer. Law enforcement training is something that I've been working on for many years. As Ohio's Attorney General, I formed an advisory group in 2014 to examine how Ohio trained its officers and to help improve the process. As a result, Ohio added more than 100 hours to its basic training, and that was a needed improvement. 100 additional hours to basic training, and that included required training on implicit bias for all the cadets. We also strengthened our standards for those applying to a police academy. Applicants now must have a high school diploma. Amazingly, that was not a requirement, or a GED. That was not a requirement before. They must pass a drug screen, and there are more criminal disqualifiers as well. The concept of adding a psychological exam was also recommended by my Attorney General's advisory group on law enforcement training. We must really condition this to Ohio's basic training to help us prevent tragedies in the future. This should occur. The taking of this test should occur prior to the beginning of the work at the academy. Ohio must make sure that only those with the right psychological makeup are admitted to the police academy and eventually issued a peace officer's certificate. Following a cadet's graduation from basic training, but before issuing a peace officer certificate, the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission will, under our proposal, check references and take other critical steps to further ensure that the candidate possesses the appropriate character, fitness, and temperament to be certified police officer in the state of Ohio. Second, I'm also announcing today that through the Ohio Department of Public Safety's Office of Criminal Justice Services, we will fund this year 2020, 6 additional hours of de-escalation training. This de-escalation training will include helping law enforcement officers understand people who have a mental health condition, people who have a drug or alcohol dependency issue. This will include use of force training, implicit bias training. These hours will be offered free to any law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio who has not already received this training in the year 2020. When I was Attorney General, our advisory group recommended an increase in the number of advanced training hours required for all Ohio officers. In response, I worked with the General Assembly to find money to pay for advanced training for every law enforcement officer in the state, 11 additional hours in 2016 and 20 in 2017, on topics such as crisis de-escalation, constitutional use of force, implicit bias, and others. There has not, however, been any required advanced training for officers in this state since. That was the last years that I was in office and continues to today. So we have to rectify that. With the exception of annual firearm requalification training, current state law prohibits Ohio from mandating advanced training unless Ohio pays for it. Some local agencies do pay for their own training if their budget allows, but not all agencies can afford this additional training, which means that some officers go years without any additional training. This is simply unacceptable. We as a state must do all that we can to ensure that all of our police officers, regardless of whether they serve in a big city, a suburb, small village, have the knowledge and skills to properly protect the public. I've never met a law enforcement officer who did not want more training. And because they understand the importance of that training. Let me say again, no matter where an Ohio citizen lives, they deserve to be served by officers who receive a set number of advanced training hours each year. So today I'm asking the Ohio General Assembly to start a discussion with me, with the Attorney General, and with the public to find a permanent funding stream for law enforcement training so that Ohio can have that specific training every single year for police officers in the state. Again, it is a patchwork. It is very uneven. Most of the major cities, if not all the major cities, have that additional training. Some have their own police academy. Some have a physical academy. But there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller departments around the state who have not been able to afford that additional training for their officers each year. We have to find a permanent funding source to deal with that. Number 3, use of force data. Transparency in law enforcement is obviously critically important. Today I'm asking the General Assembly to create a standard definition of use of force and to mandate that all agencies in the state report information on these incidents. Every time there is a use of force, that should be reported to the state, to the Office of Criminal Justice Services. Right now, unfortunately, we do not have a holistic picture of how often use of force happens in Ohio, let alone if the force was justified or excessive. This data simply is not tracked across the state, and we must begin to do that. I am today directing the Office of Criminal Justice Services to begin developing a public database to house this information. I fully intend to make submitted information then available to the public. This information should be more than just statistics. It should also include public incident reports and other supporting information to allow for a better understanding of each and every incident. The Ohio Criminal Justice Services already collects extensive data from local law enforcement. They're used to doing this. In fact, just this month, they added a new feature to their website that allows the public to look at data on certain violent crimes and property crimes from reporting agencies across the state. Police data related to use of force will not only provide transparency for all Ohio citizens, but will also improve our understanding of why these incidents happen so that we can proactively work to prevent them in the future. If you don't know the facts, it's difficult to make judgments. It's difficult to make corrections. We will be able to identify situations that most often lead to force so that we can offer de-escalation training specifically related to the scenarios that we find to be most common. Let me talk about chokeholds. I'm asking the legislature to ban this maneuver across the state of Ohio unless it is determined that the officer was justified in using deadly force. So only in those rare cases where the officer's life is in danger or where the officer is taking action to protect another individual from losing their life. Two, the only time this chokehold should be used is in life or death situations, when an officer is fighting for his or her life or protecting the life of someone else. I've asked all of our executive branch agencies with a law enforcement component, Department of Public Safety, for example, the Highway Patrol, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, our prisons, our Department of Youth Services, to examine their use of force policies as they relate to chokeholds and to comply with what I just outlined. Next, today I'm calling on the General Assembly to mandate an independent investigation for all officer-involved shootings and all in-custody deaths. It's time for this process to become automatic and mandatory for every law enforcement agency in Ohio, big and small. When I served as Attorney General, our Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, was and still under Attorney General Dave Yost, is often requested to act as an outside independent agency to do an investigation, to investigate serious officer-involved incidents, to avoid the perception of any impropriety. But requesting BCI or any other outside agency is not necessarily mandatory. It's not mandatory, meaning some agencies do investigate their own officers. Simply put, law enforcement agencies should not be investigating themselves. Even if they do a great job, there is still the appearance of impropriety. There is the appearance, and people may not trust the outcome. Even if an agency's internal affairs unit conducts these investigations strictly by the book, there can still be the perception that investigators are covering for their coworkers and their friends. The concept of internally investigating incidents involving serious harm or death is frankly outdated, and it needs to end. It does not inspire the public trust that is so very, very important. Be it BCI or another qualified neutral agency, outside investigators should always be called in to investigate every incident, every time. Now let me turn to independent prosecutions. I'm also asking the legislature to require the independent prosecution of all officer-involved shootings, in-custody deaths, and incidents that lead to serious physical harm. Even though our elected prosecutors are perfectly capable of handling these matters, they do work closely with the local law enforcement agencies in their counties. So the perception of impropriety can certainly exist. Independent prosecutions will help give the public more faith in the process, and it just makes sense to have an outside independent prosecutor assigned to these types of cases. In that same spirit, I want to talk now about Ohio State Highway Patrol investigations. Traditionally, the Ohio State Highway Patrol has been one of those agencies that investigates their use of force incidents themselves. I'm announcing today that I have directed the Ohio State Highway Patrol to no longer investigate these incidents, but to ask the Attorney General's office to do that, to ask the Bureau of Criminal Investigation to do those investigations. And I've talked with the Attorney General, and he has agreed to do that. We certainly do have a professional and good internal investigation team at the Highway Patrol, and I'm not aware of any problems with any of their investigations since I've become governor. But this is still something that I believe we must do. Let me talk about body cameras. I'm also want to talk about the body cameras. First of all, our goal should be to ensure that every police officer in the state of Ohio has a body camera. Many do, some do not. We must work to make sure that that happens. I am directing Tom Stickrath, our Director of the Department of Public Safety, and Colonel Richard Fambro of the Ohio State Highway Patrol to begin outfitting our troopers throughout the state, our Highway Patrol, with body cameras. Today, troopers have cameras on their cruisers, but the use of body cameras by law enforcement is a best practice and is essential for transparency purposes that our troopers use these as well as police officers. I'm asking the legislature to examine what help the state can provide to other local agencies in regard to body cameras. I know that we not only have an expense with body cameras, but it's also been brought to my attention by many of the mayors in the state that the storage of the information, this footage, can also be very expensive. And so we are looking at that to see what we can do to be of help, and I've asked the General Assembly to do the same thing. Let me now talk about the professional licensing of police officers. Today I'm asking our General Assembly to create a law enforcement oversight and accountability board, including members of the law enforcement community and also members of the public. We must begin treating our law enforcement officers like we treat those in other professions. They are truly professionals, and we need to treat them that way. Doctors, dentists, lawyers, barbers, those and many other occupations are held to high professional standards, often with a code of ethics. They report to oversight boards, and if they don't follow the established professional standards, their licenses can be suspended or those licenses can be revoked. Now, under current law, an officer can be fired from one agency for racial profiling, let's say, for lack of professionalism, or for simply just not doing their job. But that officer can keep his or her certificate and can carry on this behavior when they're hired somewhere else. And the sad truth is that many times the new agency does not know the background of that particular officer. Again, the vast majority of our officers do a bang-up job. They're out there protecting us each and every day. They are the ones who get the angriest when they see an officer who is not doing what they should be doing. The only way the state can revoke a peace officer's certificate today is if that officer is convicted of a felony. There's no mechanism in Ohio to revoke a certificate for conduct that might be bad, might be horrible, but it's not necessarily criminal. Now it is the time, I believe, to begin treating peace officer certificates more like licenses. And in fact, they should be licenses. This board that I'm referring to, which would be under the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission, would work with law enforcement experts from across the state and the country to establish standards and a code of conduct for Ohio's law enforcement as a profession. The board would then be responsible for ensuring that Ohio's law enforcement officials adhered to this professional code of conduct. And if not, they would have the authority to suspend and revoke a peace officer's license when necessary. This is similar to the way other professional licensed professions are treated, including physicians and including lawyers. Those within the law enforcement community who fail to report violations by other officers would also be able to be disciplined. In many professions today, if a lawyer, for example, sees another lawyer, or a judge sees a lawyer who is doing things that they should not be doing, violating the code of professional conduct, there's an affirmative obligation on that person, on that lawyer, to report that. Same way with the doctor. This is an obligation that I believe police officers should have as well. Let me now turn it to the Attorney General. Dave, thank you for coming very much, and we're anxious to hear your comments as well.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for your leadership in this area. I would like to begin by watching a 58-second video and making a quick comment, because there has been a great deal of discussion about racism and what it is and isn't, and systemic or residual or deliberate or unintended. And I'd like to make a couple of comments that are germane to this discussion, but let's watch this 58-second video that some of you may have seen already.
Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put your hoodie on. Don't be outside with no shirt on. Check in with your people. It don't matter even if you're down the street. Don't be out too late. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Don't drive with a wife beater on. Don't drive with a do-rag on. Don't go out in public with neither. Don't ride with the music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stop you randomly and start questioning you, don't talk back, just compromise. If you ever get pulled over, hands on the dashboard, and ask, could you get out your license and registration?
That video was an excerpt of the the lessons that his mom taught him, a young man. And a question that I would ask all of us, and especially those of us in the majority community, did your mom teach you those lessons? Did you have rules growing up that assumed that you start out a suspect, or that the fabric of life isn't just? This is not a law enforcement problem. This is a societal problem that has a law enforcement dimension. Police are servant heroes. Exceptions to that general rule have not been dealt with in our society, and this is the hour for that to stop. Governor, I have had several conversations in the last few weeks, and our teams have been working close together. I'm supportive of his ideas. Guiding principles for me begin with legitimacy in a government that is a self-government by, for, and of the people. It starts with legitimacy. Do people accept that most of the time the processes are fair, that disputes are fairly heard, that the same rules apply to everybody?